The bustling emergency room of Mercy General Hospital was a world unto itself, a place where the line between life and death blurred on a daily basis. Dr. Jason Miller stood at its center, a beacon of efficiency and precision. His crisp white coat was immaculate, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around him. Nurses rushed past with controlled urgency, their shoes squeaking on the polished linoleum. The waiting area was a sea of anxious faces, each one clinging to a fragile hope. Doctor? Miller's sharp eyes darted from one chart to another, his mind processing data with mechanical speed. He was revered for his intellect, for the way he could diagnose complex cases in minutes. But there was a coldness about him, a distance that separated him from his patients. Today was no different. He moved from one patient to the next, issuing orders with a clipped tone. The room buzzed around him, yet he remained untouched by its noise and emotion. "Next," he called, without looking up. Maggie Brooks sat in the waiting area, her fingers digging into her purse strap as she cast worried glances at her nephew, Sam. The 10-year-old was pale, his eyes drooping with fatigue. Earlier that afternoon, he'd fallen from the monkey bars at the local playground, hitting his head hard enough to send a wave of panic through Maggie's veins. Sam had been trying to be brave, shrugging off the pain at first, but now he could barely keep his eyes open. "Hang in there, sweetie," Maggie whispered, brushing a damp curl off his forehead. He managed a weak smile, but it did little to ease the knot of fear in her stomach. The receptionist at the front desk looked up with tired eyes as Maggie approached. "Name, please?" "Sam Brooks. He's got a head injury and he's been feeling nauseous." The receptionist typed quickly, then said, "Dr. Miller is on duty tonight. Please have a seat." Maggie's heart sank. The weight felt unbearable, the ticking clock a cruel reminder that time was slipping away. Dr. Miller finally emerged from behind the emergency room curtains, eyes focused on a chart. He barely glanced at Maggie as she stood up, half carrying Sam toward him. "Doctor, please," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "My nephew fell and hit his head. He's been throwing up and seems really out of it." "Doctor?" Miller looked up briefly, assessing the boy. The dark bruise on Sam's forehead caught his attention, but only for a moment. "It looks like a minor head injury. The walk-in clinic down the street can handle this," he said, already moving to his next patient. "We're dealing with more critical cases here." Maggie's jaw dropped. "But he's getting worse. Please, just take a quick look." "I'm sorry, ma'am. We have patients with life-threatening conditions. If his symptoms escalate, you can come back." With that, Dr. Miller walked away, leaving Maggie stunned and frozen in place. As Maggie led Sam toward the exit, her heart heavy with fear, she felt him go limp in her arms. "Sam?" she gasped, panic rising like a tidal wave. His eyes rolled back, and his body crumpled to the floor. "Help! Somebody help!" Maggie screamed, her voice slicing through the din of the ER. Heads turned, eyes widened, and suddenly the room erupted into chaos. Nurses rushed over, wheeling a gurney to where Sam lay unconscious. "Doctor?" Miller paused mid-step, hearing the commotion. He turned, his expression hardening when he saw the boy on the floor. For a moment, guilt flickered in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He stepped forward, issuing rapid-fire instructions to the team as they moved Sam to a treatment room. Within hours, the video of Sam collapsing had hit social media, shared by a bystander who recorded the entire scene on her phone. The clip showed Maggie's desperation and Dr. Miller's curt dismissal. Outrage spread like wildfire, with hashtags calling out Mercy General for negligence and systemic bias. By morning, reporters stood outside the hospital, microphones in hand. The public demanded answers. Why had Dr. Miller dismissed a clearly critical case? Was racial bias at play? The hospital board convened an emergency meeting. Dr. Miller, now the center of a media storm, sat in a small, sterile room facing senior administrators. They wore grim expressions as they laid out their findings. "Dr. Miller, effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation," the chief administrator said, her voice taut with disapproval. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, but pride held him rigid. "Understood," he replied, eyes fixed ahead. Returning home that evening, Dr. Miller found his wife, Linda, sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. Their two children, Ben and Emily, avoided his gaze as they retreated to their rooms. "Jason, what's happening?" Linda asked, her voice breaking. "People at work, even our friends, they're talking about you." He sat down, the exhaustion of the day pressing on him like a weight. "It's complicated, Linda." "Complicated?" "Our children are getting bullied at school." "Emily came home in tears today," Linda said, her anger fueled by fear. "I can't do this, Jason." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken accusations. "Doctor?" Miller ran a hand over his face, feeling the first cracks in his composed exterior. His family was suffering, and for the first time, he questioned if he truly deserved the title of doctor he had once worn with pride. With each passing hour, the reality of his actions set in, signaling the beginning of a journey that would change him forever. The morning sun barely broke through the gray clouds over Mercy General Hospital, casting long, thin shadows across the parking lot where protesters had gathered. Signs demanding justice for Sam Brooks and an end to bias in medical treatment were held high, their messages cutting through the chilled morning air. "Doctor?" Jason Miller stood inside the hospital, peering through the blinds. The voices of the crowd, shouting for accountability, were muffled by the glass but pierced his conscience like a sharp blade. The hospital board meeting that afternoon was tense. "Doctor?" Miller sat with his back straight, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Colleagues testified about his detached nature, recounting incidents where his approach had been more clinical than compassionate. "I've seen Dr. Miller dismiss patients, especially those who don't look like they belong to the ideal patient profile," said Jenny Coleman, a nurse with over 20 years of experience. This was bound to happen. The board members exchanged glances, their faces dark with concern. The room's temperature seemed to drop, and Dr. Miller felt sweat trickle down his back. This was no longer about one incident, it was a reckoning. That evening, Dr. Miller returned to an empty house. Linda had taken Ben and Emily to stay with her sister. The silence was deafening, amplifying the echo of his failures. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the framed photos on the wall. Images of family vacations, birthdays, moments filled with laughter. Now they felt like relics of another life. A call came from Sarah Palmer, an old friend and fellow physician. "Jason, I'm calling not as a friend, but as someone who's watched you work for years," she said, her voice firm. "You've always been brilliant, but something changed. When did you stop seeing your patients as people?" Her words hung in the air long after the call ended. That night, sleep eluded him. Every moment he closed his eyes, he saw Maggie's face, pleading for help. He saw Sam's limp body, the expressions of his family, the accusing eyes of his colleagues. The next day, Dr. Miller called Maggie Brooks. She answered, her voice cold and cautious. "Maggie, I'm calling to see how Sam is doing," he began. A pause. "He's stable, but he's not the same," Maggie said, her words heavy with pain. "What do you want, Dr. Miller?" "An apology won't change what happened." "I know," he replied, voice strained. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to know if there was anything I could do." Maggie's sigh was audible. "You can't undo this, but if you really care, show it by making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Motivated by her words, Dr. Miller began volunteering at a local clinic known for serving underprivileged communities. On his first day, he worked under Dr. Angela Rivera, a no-nonsense physician with a fierce dedication to patient care. The clinic was cramped and outdated, but the staff moved with a sense of purpose he hadn't seen in years. During a lull, Angela pulled him aside. "I heard about your situation. If you're here for redemption, you're in the wrong place. If you're here to work, we'll see." As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Miller's perspective began to shift. He watched Angela and the other staff treat each patient, regardless of their background, with respect and empathy. He listened to stories from patients who had been turned away or treated poorly by other hospitals. Their stories echoed Maggie's, but now he understood the depth of the problem. One afternoon, Angela shared her own experience. "When I started here, I faced skepticism every day. People looked at me and saw someone who couldn't possibly know what she was doing just because I don't fit their image of a doctor. You need to understand, Jason, this isn't just about one mistake. It's about what that mistake represents. The words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time, Dr. Miller realized he had been part of a system that perpetuated these biases, even if he hadn't intended to. Determined to act, Dr. Miller reached out to Dr. Sarah Palmer with a proposal to develop a cultural competency training program for medical professionals. They worked long hours, crafting workshops that emphasized empathy, listening, and understanding the unspoken challenges patients face. The hospital board was hesitant at first, but with pressure from the community and media coverage that hadn't yet died down, they approved the pilot program. Dr. Miller's involvement in community meetings was met with mixed reactions. Marcus Green, a local activist known for his fiery speeches, challenged him at every turn. "Why should we believe you're committed to change?" Marcus asked during a crowded town hall. Dr. Miller stood, the weight of countless eyes on him. "You don't have to believe me now, but I'm here to listen and to prove that I can be part of the solution." Murmurs swept through the room. Skepticism was palpable, but so was the faintest hint of hope. The town hall reached a peak when a familiar voice spoke up. Sam Brooks, thinner but determined, stood at the back of the room with Maggie by his side. "Dr. Miller, I know you made a mistake," he said, his young voice clear but fragile. "But if you're really here to make sure no one else feels what I did, then I think that's a good start." The room fell silent. A mix of emotions swept through the crowd, but Sam's simple statement carried more weight than any speech Dr. Miller could have given. It was in that moment that Dr. Miller understood redemption wasn't a single act, but a continuous effort. The path forward would be hard and long, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. With the pilot program approved, Dr. Miller and Dr. Sarah Palmer began the daunting task of implementing the cultural competency training at Mercy General Hospital. The initial workshops were met with resistance from some staff who felt threatened by the idea of change, but others, particularly younger nurses and doctors, embraced it as an overdue step. Maggie Brooks, who had initially kept her distance, began collaborating with Dr. Miller. She worked with him to share her story in the workshops, putting a personal face to the consequences of medical bias. It wasn't easy. Every time she spoke about the day Sam collapsed, she had to fight back tears, but the visible shift in the audience's expressions made it worthwhile. The training sessions included real-life testimonials from patients who had experienced negligence and bias. Nurses like Jenny Coleman stepped forward to share their experiences, adding layers of authenticity to the program. "Cultural competency isn't just a checkbox," Dr. Miller said during a session. "It's a mindset, a promise to see every patient as more than just their symptoms. This training is the first step, not the last." Progress didn't come without challenges. Dr. Miller faced continued skepticism from certain staff members who resented his presence and doubted his sincerity. Rumors spread that the program was just a way for him to save face. One particularly vocal critic, Dr. Greg Thompson, a surgeon known for his brusque manner, confronted Dr. Miller in the break room. "This whole thing feels like a publicity stunt. Do you really think some workshops will fix years of bias?" Dr. Miller met his eyes with a steady gaze. "No, Greg, I don't. But it's a start. And if we don't start, we'll never get anywhere." The tension in the hospital was palpable, but Linda and the kids returning home brought a glimmer of hope to Dr. Miller's personal life. While Emily and Ben were wary, the family began to rebuild slowly. Linda's quiet support reassured him that despite the rift, there was a chance for healing. The turning point came during an emergency involving a young girl named Ella, who came into the ER with severe asthma complications. The atmosphere in the ER was tense as her parents, immigrants with limited English, struggled to explain her condition. Dr. Miller, remembering the training and his commitment, approached with patience and empathy. "Take your time," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. He listened intently and worked with an interpreter to ensure he understood every detail. His demeanor helped the team provide the right treatment quickly, stabilizing Ella and preventing a crisis. Word of this incident spread through the hospital. For the first time, some of his harshest critics softened. Nurses and doctors alike noticed the change in how he treated patients, and respect began to replace the suspicion. Maggie, who had come to visit Dr. Miller in the aftermath, watched from a distance as he comforted Ella's parents. She felt a shift inside her, a seed of forgiveness taking root. A few months later, Mercy General hosted its first large-scale community health fair. Dr. Miller took part not as a celebrated physician, but as a volunteer, wearing a simple T-shirt like everyone else. The event was a collaborative effort that brought together various healthcare professionals and community leaders to offer free checkups, health education, and resources. Maggie worked alongside him, coordinating patient sign-ins and sharing their story with attendees who asked about the changes at Mercy General. Seeing Dr. Miller in this new light, some community members who had once doubted him started to acknowledge his genuine effort. Dr. Miller's greatest test came when Marcus Green, still skeptical, approached him at the fair. "You've been busy, Dr. Miller, but is this for us, or is it for you?" "It's for both," Dr. Miller said, his voice steady. "Because fixing this isn't just about clearing my conscience. It's about doing right by those I've failed and ensuring no one else falls through the cracks." Marcus nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a start. As the health fair concluded, Dr. Miller stood by a makeshift stage where local leaders and hospital board members gathered. They announced the expansion of the Cultural Competency Program to other hospitals in the region, crediting Dr. Miller and Maggie Brooks for their commitment and collaboration. When Maggie took the microphone, she spoke with unwavering strength. "This journey started in pain, but it's growing into hope. And that's what we're here for, to ensure that no one else has to experience what my nephew Sam did." Dr. Miller felt an unexpected wave of emotion. This wasn't about erasing the past, but about shaping the future. He looked out into the crowd and caught sight of Sam, standing tall next to his aunt, giving him a small, shy smile. It was a moment he would carry forever. Dr. Miller's decision to step down from his high-pressure position at Mercy General surprised everyone. He announced plans to open a free clinic focused on equitable treatment for all, supported by donations from the community and partnerships with local healthcare organizations. Maggie signed on as the volunteer coordinator, bringing her passion for change full circle. The clinic opened on a sunny spring day, filled with familiar faces from the community. Dr. Miller, now surrounded by a team trained in empathy and cultural sensitivity, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Linda and their children stood by his side, the cracks in their family slowly mending. As Sam cut the ribbon for the clinic's grand opening, the crowd cheered, and Dr. Miller felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. "Thank you for helping us," Sam said, his eyes bright with gratitude. Dr. Miller knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. "No, Sam. Thank you for giving me the chance to be better. It wasn't a perfect redemption, but it was real, and it was only the beginning." The journey toward change stretched ahead, with challenges still to come, but Dr. Miller knew he was finally walking in the right direction.